Se quer acabar com o povo indígena, acabar com os isolados, a gente não vai permitir que aconteça, não.
One of the most telling points in your director's statement was the comparison of what is happening in the Amazon with the manifest destiny propaganda and the Eurocentric white supremacy of America. What do those two events, where do those two events intersect most closely?
The movement that we see in Brazil, this northward push into the Amazon, the displacement of indigenous people, the dispossession of native land, the violence against native people, and the westward expansion that occurred in the United States, manifest destiny, and all of the associated acts of violence are part of histories and parallel national mythologies that have been built around these two colonial projects, these two countries that were built on racial slavery and a colonial bedrock. And so you see this admiration for the American West in the settlers in Brazil. You know, it's the big cowboy boots and the belt buckles and the cowboy hats and the Texas paraphernalia. But all of that is just a symptom, a sign of this much deeper ideological admiration that they have for the way that the American West was established and incorporated. There's this horrific quote from Jair Bolsonaro when he was a senator in the 1990s. He said, "It's a shame the Brazilian cavalry wasn't as efficient as the Americans who exterminated the Indians. Now they don't deal with these problems in their country." And I think that is, in a nutshell, the really horrible, grotesque ideology that's pushing a lot of these people.
It's one thing to be an environmentalist filmmaker, it's another to empower others to use the vitality of images to expose the problematic circumstance of the Amazon takeover. How do you think this visual empowerment gives the best weapon to fight against the forces of the takeover?
Oh man, I don't know if it's the best weapon. I think it takes all types of weapons.
Yeah.
We can't exclude anything in this fight that these guys are engaged in, but it's a new tool. And I think it opens up a new avenue and a new fault line in this conflict. I think it's easy to look at technology and think of it as a possible solution, a really hopeful with technology, then this will all kind of melt away, and that's absolutely not the case. The technology is a medium to convey this really important message that the Uruguay and this indigenous community have, but it in and of itself is definitely not the solution. And the bigger question is whether the rest of us are willing to listen and ready to listen to that message that they're using this technology to convey.
In words, how can you describe your most profound experience in your interaction with the rainforest? And how can that experience be a descriptor for our planet as a vital need for the prevention of the destruction of the forest?
My most sublime moments, I think, in the rainforest came at the end of every shoot. We would have a couple of days set aside for just decompression and photographing nature. And we would go out with, some wide lenses and some macro probe lenses, and it was so interesting because I'm used to being out on patrol with these indigenous groups, and we're moving quickly through the forest, trying to be efficient with our time. And when you're trying to photograph the rainforest itself, there's so much life packed into it that you really need to kind of drill down. And if I would try to walk too quickly, I would miss things. And so you could pick any square foot of the rainforest, but you just have to stop and sit and pay close attention and let yourself kind of drill down into any square inch has a world unto itself of interactions between ants and fungus and leaves and decomposition and growth, and just allowing ourselves to kind of revel in that majesty for a couple days at the end of every shoot was a really beautiful experience for us.
So great. You did a great job in describing that.
Thanks.
Your COVID experience was quite different than most of ours. Aside from changing your filmmaking strategy, how did the news of the virus become a game changer in the more remote places of the world, such as where you were? And how was it communicated to citizens?
COVID was an existential threat for the Uruguay. This is a community that saw more than half their population die of communicable diseases when they came into contact with the Brazilian state for the first time in the early 1980s. So tuberculosis, measles, the flu. And so the idea of foreign pathogens was loomed large in the collective consciousness of this community, and especially the elders. They took it really, really seriously. And so Bitate and the leaders of the community said, we are sealing ourselves off, absolutely nobody in or out. And for a year, the Uruguay were the only indigenous group in Rondônia in the entire state to have 0 COVID cases. And that was thanks to the leadership of Bitate, this really visionary young leader.
Politics, similar to the politics of America, are distinctly familiar in Brazil. How is fascism playing a role in the destruction of the rainforest, and what techniques are the propagandists using to carry out their scheme?
A lot of the rhetoric that you hear parroted by these settlers started during the dictatorship in Brazil. The idea of terra nullius, the idea that the Amazon is a blank area on the map, and we need to go out and discover it and colonize it and bring it into contact with our civilization. And that's a really harmful idea, because obviously no map is blank. There are indigenous people living there. There's a whole wealth of history and culture and language, and so those ideas, along with the idea that there's too much land for too few indigenous people. This is something you hear all the time in these conservative rural frontier areas. And there's 183 Uruguay now defending an area of 6,000 square miles, 2.5 times the size of the state of Delaware. You imagine how many Uruguay there were in that land 50, 100 years ago. It begs the question, well, how come there's so few people for so much land? Because so many of them have been killed by this colonial process. And so a lot of these ideas began during the dictatorship in Brazil, were reinforced by subsequent governments, and are now being brought back to life in an even more pervasive way by the rhetoric coming from this current administration.
Highlighting the ground level farmers who desired their own plot of land was an interesting counter to the situation. Is it, like the US, more about wealthy landowners using these folks as pawns to gain what they want, or are the farmers in on the broader picture?
Absolutely. These poor, marginalized, desperate farmers that are going out and doing the dirty work of colonizing new land are the tip of the spear on this much larger machinery that is driving the economic growth of agribusiness, monoculture, soy, and beef plantations in Brazil. And these are genuinely poor, marginalized farmers. They've been fed the false idea that it's indigenous people holding them back, when really the grand land inequality in Brazil is between these mega fazendeiros, these ranchers that have huge, conglomerations of consolidated land. And within a few years after, potentially getting title to land, these poor marginalized farmers are going to sell it back to those same big mega landowners that have been pushing them to the periphery economically in the first place.
Finally, how can you describe the respect for the earth that the Uruguay have for their land, and how that purity is the message for the rest of us?
The question for all of us is about whether we view the land, and I think implicitly a lot of us do. I grew up in a country where private property is sacred. And so I understand Sergio and Martin's and these settlers' view of the land as a commodity, as something that they hold dominion over, something they can control and extract what they want from, something they own. And sitting in opposition to that is the view of the Uruguay towards the land as something that's held communally, and something that we are born into, and that we hold a debt of responsibility towards, that we owe our time and effort to trying to uphold this land and make sure that we give back to it as much as we have received, and the plentiful gifts of this beautiful planet.
This is Patrick McDonald for HollywoodChicago.com. Copyright 2022.